So with that, I'm just going to start setting things up now for the first session, which we're kicking off at 1:30 p.m. But just to make some additional threads ahead of that. So Dazza, I'm not sure if you know on top of the folks who are going to be sort of lined up to speak, but Ashkan Soltani, he was the former chief technologist at the FTC. Was instrumental in the California Privacy Act recently in terms of a lot of the work behind that, and has been, I think, jumping in the deep end with some of the privacy related issues around COVID data sharing as well. So I'm really glad that he was able to join for this session, and I just kind of want to highlight him as someone we can call on once we start discussing that. But then, obviously, I think there's a large group of us here who are all interested in privacy and data governance, but specifically in the context of this immediate pandemic response. Dazza, I'm really grateful that you have also just leapt into action and have been gathering other people leaping into action as well. We've got Jeffrey Ladish, who's joining us. Really, really great to see you, Jeffrey. Jeffrey and I met online as well a week ago. We're both new 2020 fellows at the Foresight Institute. I just want to give a quick shout out to them. They're holding these daily salons around sense making and around various things. I've put the link to them in the Shared Summit resources page. And I encourage everybody, you all should have access to the wiki to jump in and share any resources that you've been finding particularly useful in that Shared Summit resources page. But yes, so Jeffrey and I, we're both fellows of the Foresight Institute, but he's been working on COVID Watch, which is another collaboration that I know has been working closely with the project you've been working on, Dazza, safepaths.mit.edu, and I'm hoping we're also going to have Jonathan Levy joining us shortly. But Dazza, maybe I can just hand it over to you now, just to start setting that context for that first session on COVID data sharing and pandemic response there.
Certainly. So, this pandemic has obviously changed everything, like not only due to the human toll and suffering, but our response to it, basically shutting down the economy largely and changing our very lives in terms of staying at home, closing not going to businesses, not aggregating in groups of more than a few people. Humans are social animals. Our economic and our cultural lives, all the assumptions underlying that have been really changed. And so there's so many implications. I think this is going to be the topic of the generation, and law is a big part of that. So the one part of the way that's showing up right now is very specifically with people that are creating apps and services to try to assist and aid with the pandemic response. And one of them that I'm more familiar with is contact tracing. And I think that's also in line with COVID Watch, COEPI, and a lot of groups now around the world. And so what does that mean? As part of public health, public health officials or contact tracers, the role is known as, will engage someone recently diagnosed with, in this case, COVID-19, and elicit from them where have they been, who have they been near over the last period of time when they were likely contagious. And then there's different processes that happen there. Some of it goes up to the epidemiology level for disease tracking. Some of it goes to actually reaching out to people they've been in contact with and possibly seeking that they quarantine or at least take some other measures. And there's other kind of places it goes. It may go into their medical record. So into like the clinical notes field if they're using Eclipse or things like that. So now this is happening at a big scale with a lot of people that haven't used these tools before. And there's ideas about using the tools in a way that can help flatten the curve. So as opposed to these small kind of encapsulated teams of people doing contact tracing and reaching out one-on-one, are there ways, number one, to boost that process so that it's faster and more accurate and more complete by allowing access to, say, for example, people's location history on their phone? That's a tool we have now that's all but ubiquitous. Are there ways once that data is collected to, in more of like at scale, make it available to others who may have come in contact with someone when they were contagious, so that they could take action themselves? So this directly raises questions about privacy and about autonomy with data, and then one level higher for public health authorities, hospital chains, and clinicians and others involved in this. Like in Rhode Island, for example, the National Guard, as I understand it, is part of their duty set is doing contact tracing, and working with them a little bit. How do at the institutional levels, what are the data sharing agreements look like, and what are the protections and safeguards that are needed in order to unleash the benefits of the data while maintaining the social compact with respect to privacy, civil liberties, and that balance? So that's like one little sliver that's showing up now, because that's the facet of the crisis that we're dealing with now. But I think this is going to be a design pattern that happens again and again and again as the economy restarts and billions and trillions of dollars are allocated against measures. How are these measures occurring, and who are the decision makers for what rights and obligations will be allocated, and who decides who those decision makers will be? These are all questions of data governance in part, and institutional governance, which I think which the law ought to be looked to help come up with better solutions, so that things work smoother and we avoid some disasters. So that's a quick riff on some of the issues as I see them kind of popping up. And I would love to hear from people, how is this popping up in your life? And have you heard of any issues, and especially any interesting solutions out there that people have been developing legally, that we can share and discuss?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dazza. I mean, some of those are like those core questions, but I think there's a lot of questions and issues that are going to be coming up. Maybe I can throw it over now just to Jeffrey, just to tell us a little bit about some of the privacy-related issues that Jeffrey's seen coming up in the context of his work with COVID Watch. And maybe Jeffrey, you can speak to some of that as well. Would love to hear how things are going there. So, well, what implementations you're currently seeing out in the field, and also maybe just touch on some of the interaction that you're seeing between what you're working on and then some of what Dazza's working on in terms of, I know that there is a collaboration there, and how that collaboration is working, what could be better about that, especially as we look to try and establish some of these principles for what's going to support this coordination framework.
Yeah, sounds great. And Dazza, thanks for that. I have a bunch of questions for you. Yeah, so let me tell you a bit about both what COVID Watch is doing, which is a project I'm involved in, and also sort of what the landscape looks like in terms of contact tracing apps and applications worldwide. Because there are a couple, there are the COVID Watch project here at Stanford. There's the Safe Paths project at MIT, but this is only 2 out of maybe 25 or 30 projects worldwide right now, and there's going to be more, and there's a lot of need for this right now. So I think there's sort of fundamentally there's 2 main approaches, and there are more, but there's 2 main ones in terms of technologies. One of them uses GPS to basically track your location, and then you can do a lot of different things with that data. You can keep it locally, and then only be notified when, say, public health officials say that a particular someone in a particular area, maybe a particular store, has recently there's been an exposure event at that store, and then your phone can just say, hey, I've been at that store in the last hour, or at that timestamp, it needs to notify me. That's a case where you may not be sharing your location data with any centralized database, but the fact that you've been recording your location data for yourself means that if public health officials put out a notice at this time at this place, you can be notified for that. On the other hand, you could imagine doing this in a centralized way, which some, I think, unsurprisingly, like China is taking this approach, where everyone sort of has a GPS on at all times, and as you come into contact with people, that is recorded in a centralized database, and then afterwards, if someone gets infected, you can sort of try to go through and potentially notify each person who's been within some GPS radius. So that's of course sort of obvious how GPS could be used for that. GPS is only so accurate, so there are some technical challenges around that. So another approach, which can be either standalone or in conjunction with that approach, is to use Bluetooth to sort of do proximity detection. And the benefit of this is that it can be potentially significantly more accurate than GPS in terms of detecting when you're in proximity with someone. And it also presents a sort of interesting different privacy model in that it can be potentially a bit more decentralized. So how it works is, and this is the approach that COVID Watch uses, how it works is basically, if we both have this app and I walk next to you at a park, we're walking for 15 minutes, our friends can sort of do a Bluetooth handshake and exchange some key or some number. And that exchange won't be visible to anyone else. It won't be uploaded to a server, absent anything else happening. And so I go throughout my day, I interact with a bunch of other people, and I'm sort of doing, anyone who has this app, I'm doing this handshake with in the background. Now, at some point, one of my contacts who I've been in proximity with gets sick, and they can sort of go to a health authority, and the health authority says, you've been sick. Here's this code. There could be some validation step to say, yeah, you're actually sick, and they then can sort of notify a central server that all of these apps are talking to, and say, hey, I've been sick. They don't have to say who they are, but they basically just sort of upload all of those random numbers or keys that they've come in contact with. And anyone who's on the other side of those events, can ping the server and say, hey, do any of these numbers in my local database match these contact events? And no one else can see who those people are. Only people who are actually engaged in that contact event can see who they were. And so then those apps can then notify the people, oh, hey, yesterday at 9 a.m. you were potentially exposed to someone. Please, either quarantine yourself entirely or monitor your symptoms, sort of whatever the proper epidemiological response is based on that data. So those are sort of the two main technologies, and there are a lot of different ways you can combine them, and there are a lot of different privacy models. Bluetooth can be used, like with COVID Watch. We're trying to take a pretty decentralized approach, a pretty sort of heavily on the privacy preserving side of things. But Singapore also is using Bluetooth in their application, and they are, these in the case of the Singaporean app, they are in fact, I think Trace Together it's called, but they are in fact taking those Bluetooth sort of contact events, and they are uploading them to a central server. So health authorities do then have access to that. Now they try to make it somewhat privacy preserving to make sure that no one else has access to that. But there are a continuum of different privacy models here. From sort of China on one hand, of like, as you sort of expect, like quite heavy surveillance, to I think something like what we're working on, and MIT SafePaths I think is also doing sort of a GPS version, but a GPS version where you anonymize where someone lives, and so you can see sort of some of their events, but you can't tell exactly who it is or exactly what's going on. And Dazza, you can sort of later after this, if you want to sort of go into more detail about how SafePaths work. I've read the white paper, but I might not be familiar in all of the details. But sort of, I think MIT and Stanford, and we're sort of on the more privacy oriented route, and there are a lot of different places in between. One thing I want to say about sort of like, well, I think for this for this audience, based on where sort of we are all coming from, and I actually also worked in the blockchain space for a year, so I'm somewhat familiar with sort of some of the orientation here. I think it's sort of obvious why privacy is important, even in this sort of scary time when we're faced with unprecedented potential deaths and disease. I think it's sort of obvious to us why preserving privacy is important, but I think it's not obvious to everyone. And I've definitely gotten some responses in this space of like, why now is really not the time for privacy. Why do you care about this at all? We just need to make something that works, and sort of screw the privacy angle. And I think as this gets worse, we'll see more and more calls for that. And so there's this question of like, well, what are you defending? Why is this a thing you should value? Isn't this an exceptional circumstance? And I think that there actually are some very practical reasons why this is very important, why the privacy is important, that don't even sort of bear on ideologically whether this is sort of the right thing or the just thing. And one of them is sort of maintaining institutional trust. So especially in the case of sort of trying to use something like a Bluetooth-based app, the thing that makes it work is that you need a pretty large saturation in the population. You need a lot of people to download and use this app. And if you don't, it's not very effective. I think here in the United States, people are much more suspicious of government, for better or for worse. And as a result, don't really want to download an app that will have the government track everywhere you go. They're just less likely to want to do that. And so I think by making an app that is explicitly protecting people against sort of surveillance overreach, it makes it much easier to want to engage and want to download that app and be like, yes, I'm going to be a part of this. I think sort of on the flip side, it's also better from an institutional perspective. One of the early things that I was trying to get involved with was to get the big tech companies on board. I'm like, look, we have companies that are already tracking everywhere we go. I can go to Google Maps. I can see like my location data for the last few days. Why aren't these companies involved? Why aren't they doing more in this space? And the answer that I kept getting back from these companies was, well, we are very concerned about privacy because of sort of, I mean, they didn't say this explicitly, but my inference here is that they're very concerned because of the pushback they've gotten in the past from a lot of these other sort of, concerns about potential overreach. And I think Apple in particular is very sensitive to this thing. So sort of what the answer that we got back from institutions was, well, we are very concerned about this because, this is a matter of trust for them. And so I think that this is an interesting case where, because in the US we've had this focus for a long time and sort of a conversation around privacy, I think there's actually potentially alignment between these large-scale institutions where trust in them is sort of very important for disease response, and sort of where a lot of people are coming from in terms of what they want, something that they can trust as well. So I actually think there's a very pragmatic case for why we need privacy built into this tech. And I guess the last thing I'd say is this problem is very urgent. I had a conversation with a team for the sort of the main contact tracing app effort in India this weekend, and it was notable because their application sort of was adopted by the Prime Minister's office, sort of white labeled with government approval, and has already been downloaded by over 6 million users. So they're already sort of able to test this and get good data back and scale it further. And in the US, we're significantly behind that. I don't think any of our efforts have been we haven't got that much feedback from or attention from the White House or the CDC. And I think that really needs to change, and it needs to change quickly, because this is the kind of thing where we absolutely need institutional support in order to be able to scale this to the amount of people necessary to actually make a big impact. And it's sort of sad and a little embarrassing that the United States sort of leads the world in terms of technical skills. But in this one instance where literally millions of lives are at stake, we haven't been able to pull together in terms of at the institutional level to support these efforts. And instead, we're just seeing, as a combination of volunteer work and some philanthropic effort. to develop the technology, which is great, but like we're really far from where we need to be, and I think that can turn around real fast. But I do think that there's some sense of urgency, and so I guess my ask for you guys, or anyone sort of has relative expertise in the legal side, and thank you, Dazza, for providing all of your help so far. It's just, how do we make this work at the legal level? How do we make this work at the institutional level? So yeah, any sort of help or guidance there would be much appreciated.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. So, I mean, you speak about big tech companies, and we have a Jonathan Levi who has been working with some of the big tech companies on a hopefully privacy preserving data sharing framework as well. So, Jonathan, just want to give you the spotlight right now, just to talk a little bit about what you're doing, and I also just want to recognize and just be giving a heads up to Ashka and Erica, Colin, that your thoughts will hopefully be coming up shortly afterwards. But Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tony. Yeah, so hello everybody. We created, I'm actually a Stanford graduate, just for context, but I'm going to talk about a project called MIPASA, M-I-P-A-S-A. And the idea is actually to solve some of the problem that I mentioned here, and actually something that is just listed on the chat. We started looking at the privacy preserving solution by looking at, the first step was just to look at a non-PII, right? Just some publicly available data that just has different versions and different columns, different structures, different taxonomy. And we realized that at the end of each hackathon, a lot of stuff is being built, and then shortly after, a lot of stuff is breaking. So this is like, if you look at the WHO information compared to the ECDC information, you get a CSV, a comma separated values, like an Excel spreadsheet, and some data is provided in rows, and sometimes some data sets basically just add data as columns. So every day you get like another column, and sometimes you see something like a positive column, which is somebody that is confirmed or sick. And sometimes people just remove an extra column that suddenly they don't want to talk about recovered because they're not sure. So we saw a lot of difficulties in trying to reconcile all of these different data sets. And that kind of was the beginning. And then we started talking to the big guys, and we didn't want to be the guys that were holding all this information in one place. So we said, we have a company, we do a lot of selling blockchains. I was the official release manager of Fabric 1.0, for example. So we have a lot of partners that actually use permission blockchains. And we thought, okay, look, if it's public information only, we could put it on any chain, or maybe it's going to be even cheaper to do it on permission one. But we want to basically be able to look at public information as well as some private information. So just to add to like what Jeffrey said, why do we need privacy? And basically, many people really don't understand that even though this is a crisis, and there's so many like theories about like how governments work, and I actually tend to trust people, even though I'm an applied cryptographer and I've been programming in the military, and I actually specialize in zero knowledge proofs and a lot of privacy. I still trust people, but I think that the main problem that we have right now is that if we are not going to be careful and we're going to push some regulations in kind of, this is like an alert or an emergency environment. The biggest problem that I have as a data scientist, cryptographer, mathematician, you cannot opt out, right? So if all this stuff that people are collecting, or that IoT devices are collecting and are being stored, what happens after COVID-19 and COVID, 21, right? Like you still need to go and get some insurance. And then, during a crisis, now my past history because I reported it to a doctor, or I started telling people in an insecure fashion, and it just stored somewhere just for backups. What happens later? So my concern was, look, instead of worrying about like what the government is doing and they're doing enough or not enough and the regulations are too strict or not, why don't we try to start with the public information that the governments are actually giving out and the hospitals are giving out? It's not PII. You can't tell that it's me. You can't like de-anonymize it in a measure with kind of, let's call it, with reasonable means. And then that was step one. And step two was actually, Jeffrey said there's like 2 applications and there are 26 out there. So one of the applications that we are talking to, because we're Israelis, the Israelis came up with like this model of, why don't we build, and this is the first thing that Jeffrey mentioned, right? Let's build a map of all the kind of red spots. And if I was there or in the vicinity of such a public location, maybe I can have like the contamination map. So this information, because it's already anonymized, because you don't know who was there, right? In the grocery store or at the park. At the time that I was there, I can actually create a map like that. So when we started just collecting publicly available information with CSVs, very shortly after, we started talking to a lot of application developers, and now we're actually, I don't know if it's lucky or unlucky, we're spending a lot of time now to try to build a taxonomy so that we can collect some information. And then the big problem that we have right now is it was easy to store or to not store PII when we have certified feeds from governments and some agencies that we talk to, and that's okay because these are trusted sources and there are versions, and that's fine. It's okay to get some stuff that is that doesn't contain PII, but it becomes actually more difficult, and it's good that we're talking to, especially in the context of Stanford Law. I can take a lot of private information, and when I combine and triangulate, suddenly I can easily de-anonymize it, right? So it's not so clear how much we can store in one place and how much can we store in an immutable fashion, such as the blockchain that is distributed. So we kept the core, and I talk a little bit about the tech. I don't know how much time I have. Do I have like a few minutes? A minute, 2, 5? I don't want to.
Yeah, take a few more minutes, John.
Okay, cool. So on the tech side, right, we have a permission chain that is running on multiple clouds. So we didn't want IBM to have it all, Oracle to have it all, Microsoft to have it all. So we have like the core enablers, basically the permissioned nodes that actually certify, and we know who they are, and they know what the guys that are validating transactions. And then we have a workflow that we are working very tirelessly to certify. And if people here want to join and help us on the legal side, please do, because we're doing it for free. We're giving away all of our kind of products now for this course for free. IBM, Oracle, Microsoft, Splunk. We have so many like companies that are giving us a lot of stuff just to do the right thing. And the idea is basically to allow people to have a workflow that we collect everything, version it, putting it on a timeline, using the same taxonomy to make sure that machine learning, AI, hackathons can use the same data and to integrate other applications. So the MIT application is one. I think we're going to have a lot more. And what we're trying to do is actually to make sure that the regulators are okay with that, because we're really not trying to break the law or even, and definitely not like harm people. We're trying to just to help. Okay, so that's call to action from our end now. At this point, we're still collecting a lot of data sets. If you know about more data sets, so I saw some stuff that is written here by Erica. We actually store and index all of them. So please get in touch. But more data sets are welcome. We're in the process of evaluating what is okay, what can we use, we can formalize. And I think that in a week or two, we're just gonna release it to all the hackathons around and integrate with many stats departments and research institutions. Yeah. Any questions, I'm also happy to help and answer.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jonathan. So Erica, since your name was referenced there, I wonder if I can just ask you if you have any immediate thoughts and comments on what's been shared so far. And then you were sharing something earlier, but just for everyone's context, Erica is a public health professional who has been establishing some of the most widely used public health learning frameworks, courses as part of NextGenU, which is an online free distance learning platform that Erica has set up and is being inundated right now with a lot of people seeking her help with providing public health distance learning frameworks. So I really appreciate, Erica, you making the time to be here and offering some of your perspectives from, I guess, the front lines and from the community that we're in many ways trying to serve here, some of these users. So if you have any reflections, the spotlight is yours.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tony. So yeah, I'm going to wear my hat as the Canada Research Chair in Preventive Medicine and Population Health at the University of British Columbia. And I think just sort of taking a high-level view to start with, I think that what I share y'all's optimism about the possibilities of ending up with a healthier and more collaborative and more digitally based world at the end of this pandemic or this phase of the pandemic. I worry that that this will be another opportunity for a manifestation of what Naomi Klein describes as being the shock doctrine. There are people with, it seems, far less altruistic motivations than ours who are flooding these spaces as well. I think we have a heavy obligation to move assertively into them. And I think we have a real opportunity here, because the thing that's different about COVID, and I've just been reflecting on this during this call, is that there is a global collaborative component to it that everybody realizes, and it's the people in their homes, and it radiates all the way out around the world. There's, I think, been few times from a health perspective that the butterfly wings flapping here affects everyone, right? So I think that we can capitalize on that to move things into a less capitalistic approach and a more collaborative one, using the myriad examples of people being generous and collaborative and working toward a greater shared good with all boats floated. So that sort of as an overview, the two particular pieces that have really blossomed for me as a result of this, not being, in this case, a hands-on clinician, though I am a physician, but trying to do some of these higher level pieces rather than clinical care, because that's what my primary training's in, are expanding, like Tony was saying, nextgenu.org, which is in essence the world's first free university. I've invented NextGenu in 2001. We've been offering since 2006 courses, and now since for a decade, the world's first free accredited courses online. And so we do have, as Tony mentioned, the world's first free degree in MPH, and are really excited to use this kind of opportunity to move toward things like creating a free law school online. And also one other sort of subset project, and I'll close with this perhaps, that COVID's tragedies has unearthed is I've just been setting up a new nonprofit called meethere.org, because of course professional society conferences and lots of other meetings are being canceled globally. We are planning, we have been and are continuing in our expansion on using Zoom in some of the lovely ways that you've seen today as one of our foundations, but setting up a nonprofit so that not only can conferences do the networking and education and organization building right now during COVID that they want to, but so that post-COVID, the hundreds of thousands of tons of carbon that get released with that kind of travel regularly for any meeting. And I'm happy to share, I will share an article on the 300,000 tons of carbon from one meeting in San Francisco. That is one of my favorite articles to cite here. So this to me is a prime example of something where we can end up on the other side of this with a far less carbon intensive way for us to meet and grow. So those
Thank you,
are
Erica. I think we'll be touching on some of those broader issues in terms of how we coordinate around carbon and climate in the next session. But thank you especially just for the work you're doing around coordinating public health professionals as well with those kinds of online tools. And I think that community of professionals and how we can just always be making sure that their voices are being heard as part of how we're designing all of these different flows is paramount. Something that I know that Dazza has been very, very involved in is just the specific design of consent coordination, how public health professionals on the front lines can be supported in that whole process of obtaining consent, and what are good ways to design for those. And I know that in particular is something that Ashkan, obviously in his role both as a technologist, as a researcher of policy and privacy, has been thinking about a lot. So Ashkan, maybe at this point, and unless Dazza has something that he wants to sort of contextualize in that reference, but Ashkan, maybe I can pass it off to, well, both of you, if either of you have specifics you want to sort of bring back in now in terms of that privacy and the consent design piece.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from Ashkan, and I'll pipe in if helpful.
Or sure, or if you have any quick thoughts first. I took a couple of notes.
Hot potato.
Yeah, happy to jump in. So I recognize that, and I think this is wonderful that you guys are collaborating, and I know Peter Eckersley quite well. We, he and I and some folks at ACLU, Dan Kahn, Gilmore, and others have been working on these issues, talking to a couple of the large tech companies about what they're interested in doing and what are some potential, value adds and pitfalls. And so I think, as we've seen recently, there's an incredible desire to do something to solve issues surrounding this pandemic. And I think that's a great kind of inkling. Everyone's trying to figure out how to help. The challenge is that because of the complexity of these issues, and particularly around the use of data, not just privacy, but just in general around policy and the lack of understanding about the efficacy of data, there can sometimes be a number of issues created, right? So, I find that a lot of policymakers don't understand the caveats, the nuances, the limitations of data. They don't know the provenance, how it was collected, and therefore they make assumptions on data that may not be valid. For recently, for example, we've seen a huge number of heat maps generated by Bidstream data or SDK data that's taken from GPS from certain mobile apps, and those are used as kind of marketing material for these data companies. But often they're limited in their effectiveness. They're have a limited sample. The one from Unicast from the Wall Street Journal maybe about a week ago now, for example, showed Alaska as scoring the best in their shelter in place, even when they didn't have a shelter in place. And that was because of the kind of urban nature of the cities there, or of the kind of population there, and the lack of dense cities and lack of a lot of movement there. So that's just to say there are a number of pitfalls. In general, I've seen the kind of the data efforts around COVID to be really ways to find proxies for infection, find proxies for general movement, whether people are doing quarantine in place or whether they're kind of active or not, and then proxies for contact tracing. And I think all of them have value, but none of them supplant the critical need for the core thing, which is effective testing, right? So if we had effective testing on a wide scale, distributed on a wide scale, there would really be very little need for any of this data, at least. In an ideal world, which we won't ever get to, if we had 100% testing, we would have a perfect picture at any given time of what the kind of infection rates are, and wouldn't need to actually invest in these technologies. But we're not there, and so we're relying on some of these technologies. The questions I have currently as we're building these apps is one, in our current, like today, is the response to any of these, like for example, the contact tracing apps, is the response to whether you've been in contact with someone going to be any different than what the current response is, which is kind of, minimize contact, don't expose yourself, wear a face mask, etc. Right? I know a lot of the policy responses to not having adequate test kits were like, well, even if you tested positive, would you do anything differently? So that's one question. But of course, that's going to change. And I think that change is actually what's going to be more problematic. One, you have the issue of false negatives, right? So the Trace Together app in Singapore found that they missed more than 50% of their new outbreaks. They couldn't account for where those outbreaks came from, even with the Trace Together app. And mind you, they only have 1 million installation of a population of 5 billion. But it's still interesting to think about the false negatives. And these are kind of going to be things like people that don't have cell phones, people that don't carry their phones when they're interacting with other people at the door, people that might share a phone, etc. There's a great little 2-page white paper that came out of Korea. Folks saw that around the very early case study of the use of data for contact tracing. I can paste that in the channel if people haven't seen that, but it highlighted all the limitations of the use of data for contact tracing by their epidemiologists. And what they found is that, yes, data is helpful, but only in conjunction with human kind of interviews. So they had GPS data, financial transaction data, interview data, and like camera CCTV data. And they found that for the contact tracing to be effective, they had to manually go through and test for things. For example, whether people actually interacted or not, right? And so that's the false negative side. The false positive rates, I think, are even potentially more problematic, right? Because to the degree that we then further take action based on this information, we're going to have to be mindful of false positives. And even 100% agree that Bluetooth is better than GPS, but Bluetooth, again, like I have a neighbor, I can see their Bluetooth networks through my wall. I've never interacted with them. Now, maybe through the air duct system, my probability of having contracted it has gone up, but it's still something of concern. The other thing that false positives gives me alarm is, as we know in all of these technologies, abusers, hackers are going to try to get at that. And so injecting essentially infection kind of numbers into the stream, falsely generating, and I know you currently have a model where the authority will give some sort of code that will permit you to mark yourself as infected. That will be challenging when we start doing commercial testing and distributed testing, which is the way we're going to move to. We might have to have some proof, but even there, we know historically it will always be abused. And so both, I know you guys are all mindful of those. And so the thing to think about, though, from the policy perspective, which is kind of the perspective that I kind of come from, people are going to, if it works, if it gets adoption, people are going to use it and rely on it, and they're going to rely on the ground truth without recognizing those limitations. And like I said, right now, there's no real implication of, scoring, being contact traced with someone who has it because your behavior is not changing. But in, say, a month or 2 months, we're going to be permitted to go back out into society. And so the kind of implication of a false positive could potentially restrict your movements, could potentially restrict you from being able to leave the house, enter the workplace, travel, etc., which is, of concern. Often, like in addition, you might find that if this again gets brought into adoption, what a lot of the companies are worried about in demonstrating a tech that works too well is compelled disclosure from governments. Even with privacy-preserving tech built in, they will, attempts to de-anonymize or to access or to link back to the original data, because that's information that the government will know, particularly in this administration. And then finally, just a kind of general perspective, Google, I often joke that for the proxies of infection, right? So Google has been promoting flu trends for decades, right? As a justification for collection and retention of search information, because they would argue that, oh, this is such a wonderful data set. Over time, we found out that it actually doesn't work so well, but it's embedded into the culture, and particularly of policymakers, that this data is going to be the answer, and therefore we should collect more of it and we should always retain it, et cetera, not necessarily in a privacy-preserving way. I find that those policy outcomes are problematic long-term, because well after this pandemic is over, we're going to find this reliance of of requiring or compelling this type of data collection for national security or national health reasons. And you know, I would be mindful of setting that policy, particularly when it has all these other limitations that we just discussed. So that's kind of my general view of the world.
A couple of thoughts on that. So I'm glad you went first. That was excellent, I think. And on the consent thread, you know, as you look at a lot of these contact tracing apps and similar, there's, I think, because of the developers of like click to accept, if there's even a privacy policy and terms and conditions to accept in the apps, a lot of these are being rolled out very quickly. Probably what's needed for this type of data is something more like consent, as opposed to like a commercial click wrap for an end user license agreement. So I posted in the Slack channel some general privacy principles for contact tracing that we just published last night at law.mit.edu, the MIT Computational Law Report. It's just a working draft. And I should thank COVID Watch and others for helping the MIT SafePaths team to put this together. But we actually made a big subsection on consent and the need to, you know, track something, you know, maybe something around like GDPR level of consent. It's informed and voluntary. People need to know what they're consenting to. So, you know, the contact tracing for sure, but what are the secondary uses and what are the risks of re-identification and so forth. You know, medical consent or human subjects research type consent may be a little too heavy, but we need something just right for this type of data and these types of risks. So we've got some initial ideas there, and there's a Google form for people that have better ideas like corrections or amendments that you'd suggest. It's a work in progress. You know, what's coming up right around the corner, I'm sorry, the other critical thing for a lot of these apps is if you didn't have the data to start with, it's impossible for later abuse by government or others, data breach or deliberate tyranny. And so, you know, we've got a practice in these general privacy principles, and that we've been propagating, I think I can say, through the MIT SafePaths on private kit process, where the implementers, like those that are deploying it, are expected or at least it's recommended that they delete the data that after a period of, we were advised from our resident epidemiologist, 21 to 28 days seemed about right. It would no longer be of any clinical value after that point to track back to somebody to see if they were contagious. So we thought deletion's part of it. The other part, Bluetooth has been mentioned. Proximity data is not location data. It really just has a kind of pseudonymous identifier as part of the Bluetooth, you know, kind of data that you can then identify when people were near other people, and there's different privacy protecting schemes to further obfuscate that data or to transform it with a one-way hash and do matches. But I think that the Bluetooth is another very important technology to look at where we don't even have location data to start with. And then the other thing is right around the corner, we're talking a lot about contact tracing now, but the next big wave is going to be antibodies for re-entering the workforce. And so I think there's big questions around what the legal and policy regimes ought to be around a verifiable assertion that somebody has, say, antibodies to COVID-19 and maybe have special privileges to do more. Well, there's a lot of, let's just say, economic, social, and even civil liberties implications around that. So how that ought to come together, I think it's not too early to be thinking about that. And then finally, like the big questions that you just raised had a lot to do with the social compact. And you talked about, you know, potential later, I would call it almost tyrannical use or abuse of this data. And we're seeing some examples in other countries. So we've got this stack, a law review articles I'm very proud of that go to, you know, way back to the Black Plague and, you know, more recently yellow fever, H1N1, Ebola, all these interesting legal frameworks around the world that are looking at these balances between forcing people not to gather, forcing people to stay in a location, forcing people to disclose certain information due to a public health emergency. But there is a balance, habeas corpus, and, you know, and others. There's a number of balances around, you know, how much is the right amount of power for the government to exercise? What are the rights that remain for citizens, and how are these things balanced? So we've started a research project that we'd love help with. Brian Wilson, who's on the call, has helped me create a crowdsource way to go through these law review articles and pluck out like the best of the legal frameworks of the past, good ideas that people have put out in law review articles that maybe haven't been implemented or seen the light of day, dystopian disasters that have occurred in the past, the so-called shotgun quarantines and so forth, legal instruments and model legislation and regulation. So we'd love some help in going through doing a bit of a literature review to see the best thinking from the past that maybe we could strip mine and have that be an input to good thinking and guidance in the future of how we get through this thing.
By the way, just in a line, also like to risk adjust, you know, there's so much risk involved and people think that, you know, it's very risky. Yeah.
Just if I can just respond, absolutely. I think so retention limits are a great technical implementation, of course, right? But one of the things, you know, the use of kind of opt-in consent generally, I find very limited, particularly when it's a matter of personal health, right? So the social pressures are going to be significant individually. As a kind of group dynamic, including whether you're permitted to go back to work or whether you're permitted to be around my friends. I remember my friend wouldn't let his parents play with his kid until they demonstrated they had a particular Tdap shots, etc. So imagine that on a larger scale. And then to your point about it being tyrannical, I'm not sure that that's the use that I'm most worried of. This is actually from a policy perspective, kind of almost legitimate from a national security perspective, right? It's not currently, we have effectively shelter-in-place orders are kind of a huge invasion of civil liberties, and they've been kind of implemented with the soft touch, although we've seen certain jurisdictions ticket and send some, you know, police take some action just to send messages. But it is, you know, I think it's not around tyranny, it's around kind of just a policy perspective. And we've seen from national security reasons these types of policies put into place with most of, you know, 60% plus of society, you know, the citizens actually supporting these type of ventures. If you look at all the Pew and all the recent polls, right? Mm-hmm. And just as a context, I also worked as kind of a reporter on national security issues. One of the programs I helped highlight was this program called Co-Traveler, which was a kind of US intelligence program whereby they would identify people that had intersected paths kind of or traveled with or intersected paths with known people of interest that they had already set up surveillance with as a way to indicate potential new targets for surveillance. And again, that was done anonymously using IMEIs and just device IDs, but not necessarily privacy invasive, but it was incredibly effective for generating who to follow. So as I think about this stuff, I think about kind of more the policy implications, particularly as you said, like, you know, so Germany is evaluating citizens, certificates for people that have had antibody tests, right? So how is that going to essentially change, you know, will there be, you know, kind of to switch to like dystopian sci-fi narratives, will there be a class of people that are permitted to roam freely, you know, if they show their papers, which again, Germany, you know, bad optics there, but, and everyone else is required to stay at home. So again, like, this information, as you guys are all experts, it's incredibly tempting to use and use this data. It's just, you should take it from a lens of like, what happens when you put it in front of a policymaker that doesn't understand the ramifications, the limitations, the bias issues, the privacy issues, and particularly when we have this kind of administration in the US, but also across the world.
Yeah, and just on that tip, part of the reason I picked up on that little thread that you mentioned around, you know, misuse and abuse, and then I added the tyranny word in, was looking at what's going on around the world. So at least the MIT Safe Paths app, which we're rolling out to a nonprofit imminently, or already have, I think, is being picked up not just in US jurisdictions, but around the world, where there's very different types of regimes. And there is also you know, a concern among technology providers that that we propagate, you know, post-Enlightenment values when we can. Internally, or domestically, I should say, when you're talking about national security, I played in that field a little bit in the distant past as well. I've noticed in these law review articles that there's a subtle but important difference between the parents, the inherent powers of the state to operate under public health emergency as distinct from national security And so there's been overlap between martial law stuff and public health stuff, but it's subtly different. And one of the things we want to do with this research effort is really pin down precisely how is it different and what's the existing legal and jurisprudential fabric that we're starting with, so we can be more informed. And then, at the front end of the high upstream has to do, there's a lot we can do with the types of technologies that we're collaborating to put out there and creating some norms in that way, so that later what is possible and some of the policy type decisions that will be made can be somewhat framed by getting the technology right upstream, and we are upstream today.
Yep, and one last thing. On your research effort, there's a group called the Privacy Law Scholars Conference. And so they have this fantastic conference every year. They're obviously moving to be remote, but all of the privacy law scholars are obviously now focused, not all, but a lot are focused on this issue. So that might be a good it's kind of the foremost experts on privacy law internationally. So PLSC.
Could you put us in touch?
I'll just paste it in the channel. Yeah.
Great. I just want to do a quick time check. We've got 7 minutes till we sort of switch over sessions. So if anybody has something that they want to just throw in at this point, if you could just pop a little message in the Slack channel, and I'll try and find a bit of time just for your comments. But obviously, all of these discussions will be continuing, and we're happy to put anyone in touch with anybody else. I wanted to, Inder, I don't know if you're there and available just to offer some of your quick perspectives as we were talking about some of the executive actions. And I know in terms of between you, Dazza, Jonathan Askin here, we've got Anya, Fatima, there's various groups who are coordinating, various folks who are coordinating some of these research activities. And so again, to the extent that there's a commons of research review and collection that we can sort of build out as one of those actions, I'm excited for that potential. But Inder, maybe I can just ask you just to say hello and talk a bit about some of the stuff you're doing in this moment related to this.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's great to be on a Zoom call. So yeah, I don't know where to start, but I've known Tony for many years now, and one of my passions is executive power, basically. And in the context, for many years I was working on this in the context of the Iraq War, and now that's switched more to thinking about this in the context of climate emergencies. So one of the things that is very close to my heart is this concept of crisis dictatorship, which is kind of this notion of Hobbes's Leviathan, right, emerging in the 21st century again. When Hobbes was writing, he was writing in the context of the English Civil War, which was a civil dispute which killed a lot of people. But how are governments going to evolve or mutate in the same way that SARS, 2003, we've had some mutations of the virus, and now the virus has taken a more violent form. And from my perspective, governments are also mutating in the face of changing environmental and social conditions. And part of that is this development of this, what I view as this type of crisis dictatorship, where the very real biological crises that are now coming up, environmental, biological crises that we will have to deal with, become the grounds and the basis for indefinite or even, indefinite government control, new forms of government control. We could talk about, Foucault wrote a lot about biopower. We're seeing the nature of governments mutate in terms of the ways and means that they can control biopower. And, you can look at the 192 countries that exist today, governments that exist nationally. And, it's almost a case study in how each government is responding and reacting. Hungary, I think, is a good example of how of a government that's just blatantly taking advantage of all this to institute a crisis dictatorship. And Orban does not have, he has indefinite emergency powers. So, this is definitely an interest of mine. I'm running a summer program this summer, virtually, as it will probably end up being. It was supposed to be in New York, but now I think it'll be over Zoom through my nonprofit. I have a nonprofit that does a lot of internship programs. So we're going to have, I think, about 10, maybe 12 law student interns from just fantastic places, fantastic backgrounds. Several students from Columbia, Harvard, Stanford, mostly 1Ls, a couple 2Ls, Michigan, Northwestern. We're gonna have this fantastic group of people who have been pitched on this idea also of looking at the contours of executive power in the context of climate. right? But maybe that like all we're doing and acting, all the issues that are coming up today with the coronavirus are just a preview, right? I mean, this is just a trial run for how governments are going to respond, and imminently, but like 5-10 years out, when ice caps really start melting, and people really have to start leaving the coastlines because of immediate collapse of social systems. So this is something I'd love to obviously be part of or work more on. And just briefly, my understanding of in the U.S. this distinction between state versus federal police powers is absolutely right. I think on point. It's the states have general police powers, the federal government doesn't. But there is law in place, going back to the beginning of the Republic, for the states to basically blow the whistle and call the federal government out, like in Shays Rebellion or the Whiskey Rebellion, or talking about also the government also has the statutory right. Congress has given the executive the right to enforce federal law through the use of the military. And of course, there's this Posse Comitatus Act. I think it's pretty well known. This ability when the military can step in and basically take over is very fuzzy federally, and there really isn't a basis constitutionally for this concept of quote unquote martial law, other than suspension of habeas, the suspension of habeas clause. But otherwise, it's not really mentioned. So anyway, this is all stuff I'm super fascinated in, and we'll be researching heavily all summer in the context of climate. So I think this would be a great. If anyone's interested in collaborating, just let me know or reach out.
Fantastic. Thank you, Enda. I think that we will have hopefully a fair few collaborations around some of this research coming out of this. In the last couple of minutes, I just want to throw over very quickly to Robert. You said you had a perspective on what's happening in China to share with us. So Robert's just been spending the last couple of years in China.
Yes, I just wanted to, there was a comment made about how what was happening there was centralized, and I wanted to actually just push back on that and say that it actually is not. The way that the health code rollout is going in China is on a municipal and provincial and sometimes sub-municipal level. So different municipalities, different city governments, and then different districts will have different health code systems. So there was a headline, for example, recently run in the paper in Beijing, laughing about how you'll have like one person, 6 codes. And so this is a very, it's actually, China's a much more fragmented system than sometimes people think. And so this has not yet been done at the national level. The state council has actually said, they want municipalities and cities to kind of pump the brakes a bit on the extent to which health codes are being rolled out. I mean, I would say I think it's likely that there will ultimately be some version of a national health code, but at this moment in time, it's actually a very fascinating situation where you have, this all started, just for those who've not been following it closely. So basically in early February, Alipay piloted a health code rollout with the city of Hangzhou. And then since that, there's been a lot of other cities piloting, working with Ali and working with WeChat to roll these health codes out. And so WeChat and Tencent have been working with NDRC, the National Development and Reform Council, which is, you can think of it as a kind of an economic think tank body, but with teeth, and has policy actions. And then Alipay and Ant have been working more with the state council. So that's the national level environment, but there's not been something at the national level yet. And then you have now at this point 200 plus cities that are using either Ali's codes or WeChat codes or a combination of both. But on the practical, on the ground environment in China, the way that works is, let's say you're based out of Hubei province and you want to go to Beijing. Well, you have to then get your code for Beijing, and then you may have a code within Beijing that you need to use, and it may be that code within that one district in Beijing isn't compatible with that other code, and then so now you have 3 codes. You have your home code, you have your Beijing 1 code, you have your Beijing 2 code. So very not centralized, and that's actually very much indeed a problem. So it'll be interesting to see in the months ahead how policymakers in China kind of address that issue.
Brilliant. Robert, thank you so much for offering that perspective from China. And I think that speaks to, again, this broader pattern around interoperability. So grateful to Jeffrey, Ashkan, Enda, Erica. Thank you for offering those perspectives, and Dazza, of course. And I think as we now sort of look to this next session around